What? What's wrong with my tie? At least my clothes aren't rotting off my body. Hi everybody! Welcome, once again, to Stately Vaughn Manor. And today, it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Yes, it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, Steve Donoghue and I, on our respective channels, will talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. This week, we're talking about a comic book subject, one that Steve Donoghue was really excited to talk about. Yes, we're talking about the Marvel horror comics from the 1970s. Yes, the Marvel horror comic books from the 1970s. Back in the 1970s, the evil Comics Code Authority were loosening up their authority a little bit. Those evil bastards, the Comic Code Authority. So they were loosening up their authority. Up to this point, in the 1970s, in the comic books, they wouldn't let you have vampires be called vampires, or werewolves, or zombies, or anything fun, really, from horror comics. They wouldn't let you have any of that. But they decided in the 1970s to kind of loosen their rules a little bit, because they figured, you know, at this point, nobody's scared of this stuff anymore. So they decided to loosen up their rules, which was great for Marvel, because there was this other company called Warren who were putting out these black and white horror comic books, eerie and creepy, and they were making like a little bit of money. And Marvel's like, we want some of that money. So Stan Lee decided he wanted black and white horror comic books too. And he wanted a whole line of black and white comic books. And he created The Savage Sword of Conan, for example, as the most famous black and white Marvel comic book. But he also did a bunch of horror comic books, black and white horror magazines that had black and white horror comics in them. And so he created these. And he also wanted to create some color comic books, a color horror line. And for those, he decided to go with the old classics, the old standbys, Dracula, Frankenstein, and a Wolfman. You know, those characters we all know but weren't scared of anymore. And he decided to make horror comic books out of those characters. You know, you can't lose with those guys, right? So Stan Lee went all in on the horror comics. And the greatest of these comics, which they produced at this time, was, of course, The Tomb of Dracula. The Tomb of Dracula, which most of the issues were written by Marv Wolfman. All of the issues, every single issue, was illustrated by Gene Colan. This was the crown jewel of Marvel's horror line. Just a great, great series of comic books. Gene Colan did a wonderful, wonderful job on the artwork. Tomb of Dracula was amazing. And also, Tomb of Dracula, besides just having great story and art, it has to be said that Tomb of Dracula maintained its quality. It stayed a good comic book through the entirety of its run, and it lasted a while, Tomb of Dracula. Definitely lasted longer than any of the other Marvel horror comic books, and stayed a good comic book that whole time. You can't say that for any of the other Marvel horror comic books, that's for sure. So this was the crown jewel. Now, Steve and I have already talked about this particular comic book. I'll leave a link down below, if I remember, to the Tomb of Dracula video that I did for Marvel Comic Book Wednesday, because it is a part of Marvel horror. So if you're interested in Marvel horror, this was the big one. But since I already talked about it, I'm going to concentrate this episode on the other Marvel horror comics, particularly the color line of comics. Now, to talk about the Marvel horror comic books at this time, I have to talk about a particular artist who was all over the Marvel horror comic books at the time. He probably worked on every Marvel horror comic book practically at the time, and that was an artist named Mike Ploog. Mike Ploog is the one who did the earlier issues of Werewolf by Night. He's the one who drew this brilliant cover to the omnibus here. Mike Ploog was an interesting artist. He was kind of a quirky artist. He was different. He did not draw in the Marvel style at all. He wasn't hired by Marvel. Marvel wouldn't hire him because he was so different, and he would look frankly ridiculous drawing superhero characters. That just wasn't his thing at all. But he was great for horror comic books. He had a kind of a cartoony style, and yet he could also be kind of creepy. So he was kind of perfect for a horror comic book. Horror comic books, remember, are not frightening, and nobody is frightened by horror comic books, but they are fun. Marvel horror comic books are the kinds of things that you'll enjoy if you like schlocky B horror movies. You know, if you like that kind of stuff, you're gonna like Marvel horror comic books. If you don't like that kind of stuff, you probably won't like it so much. Me, I loved that stuff when I was a kid. I loved monsters, and I still love the Marvel horror comic books. I just think they're so much fun. And Werewolf by Night was my favorite Marvel horror comic book by far. It is one of my favorite comic books. Mike Ploog did just such a wonderful job illustrating these earlier issues of Werewolf by Night, telling the story of young Jack Russell, who on his 18th birthday became a werewolf, and all of his many adventures once he became a werewolf. Mike Ploog just did such a brilliant job. I mean, that's his werewolf right there. It is just so classic. Such a brilliant job illustrating this werewolf. You can see his kind of cartoony horror style there. And Werewolf by Night was always, you know, fighting other creepy monsters like this one. And you could see Mike Ploog's style there. It was unique and really, really cool. It worked really well. He did do a little bit of Dracula when the Wolfman met Dracula, or Werewolf by Night met Dracula. Had an interesting take on Dracula, as he does all of his characters. The artwork was just really cool. I really like Mike Ploog a lot. Mike Ploog is one of my favorite artists from this time period. And the comic books he worked on tended to be really good while he was on the book. He was on Werewolf by Night for a little while. Eventually, we moved on to other artists and other writers. The book did suffer. About halfway through its run, it started to lose some of its quality. It was still fun, but you can see the artwork just isn't as cool without Ploog. Who did this? This is Don Perlin. Don Perlin did this book for a while, and just wasn't as good. It got really weird towards the end. Eventually, the Marvel horror line kind of lost popularity. The idea of Marvel horror comic books lost popularity. At the end of this run, you had Werewolf by Night meeting Iron Man. You know, once superheroes start showing up in your horror comic book, it's over. Pretty much. Only Dracula could get away with that. Dracula was a strong enough character, he can get away with having like superheroes in his comic. Every other horror comic book character, if a superhero showed up in your comic, it was over. You know, you were just done. You couldn't survive that. Superheroes are just so otherworldly and comic booky that any kind of horror you're trying to maintain, even if it's just schlocky comic book horror, it doesn't work. And so, yeah, that was the end of Werewolf by Night. Famously, Moon Knight did appear as a character in one of the later Werewolf issues. I like I like Moon Knight quite a bit. I like Moon Knight a lot. And so Moon Knight made his first appearance in a Werewolf by Night issue. I wonder if I could find it. I'm looking for it, so of course I won't find it. That's the way it works when you're doing videos. If you're looking for something in a book, it's nowhere to be found. Okay, here it is. I'm lying. Here's Moon Knight. Moon Knight makes his first appearance there towards the end of the Werewolf by Night run. So at this point, it's not the best comic book in the world compared to what it was, but it was great. for a while. Steve's going to have an entirely different opinion. Just don't listen to Steve. But yeah, Mike Ploog did that. Mike Ploog actually, like I said, he was a dynamite artist for that kind of thing. He did. I'm going to throw this up there, even though it's not a Marvel horror comic book. It was of the same time period with Mark Ploog artwork. He did the Planet of the Apes, Marvel black and white magazine. One of Marvel's best magazines, best black and white magazines, other than Savage Sword of Conan, was oddly enough Planet of the Apes. And it had a bunch of artwork in it by Mike Ploog, some black and white artwork by Mike Ploog. And it was just dynamite. His Planet of the Apes work, it might be his masterpiece, his Planet of the Apes work. Just really, really cool Planet of the Apes artwork. Just really, really cool stuff. His style was great. And like in this particular story, this story is reproduced directly from his pencils, just because he's so cool. So this stuff is all available digitally. So you should check that comic book out. All of these comics that I'm showing you, for the most part, most of them are available on digital. You can get all the Werewolf by Night, all Dracula, and of course I have to mention the Monster of Frankenstein, their other book. This was probably their least successful book, the Monster of Frankenstein. Again, it started off with Mike Ploog artwork that was really, really good. Look at that great cover there. The Monster of Frankenstein. Started off with a multi-part adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It wasn't an exact adaptation. They changed it quite a bit. But it was an excellent first few issues. This is his Bride of Frankenstein, not the most attractive creature in the world. But you get an idea of what this comic book was like. I think the initial few issues of The Monster of Frankenstein were really, really good. But this is one of those comics that fell apart fairly quickly. Literally almost the moment Ploog left this book, it could not survive it. It just fell apart as soon as Ploog left. And it was really interesting up to that point, because you have the adventures of this character, the Monster of Frankenstein, who's very much like Mary Shelley's version of Frankenstein's monster. He's intelligent. He does commit horrible crimes. He's kind of driven to them. But just really interesting. And you kind of wanted to follow this guy around and kind of find out what he was going to be up to. And it was really cool for a while. But then Ploog left, and we got some artists that I think were not so great. John Buscema, actually, I did a couple of issues that were pretty good, though. John Buscema did this issue where the Frankenstein monster, of course, meets Dracula. Frankenstein monster has to meet Dracula. And those were a good couple issues. But after that, after Buscema left the book, he only did a couple issues there. Not so great after Buscema left. But up to that point, there were some good artistic moments. After that, like in this volume, the Frankenstein monster was in some of the black and white issues. He was in Monsters Unleashed. The black and white Frankenstein stories were not great. They were okay. Nothing to write home about. The later color comic books were just not great at all. So this is one of those series that kind of went off a cliff early. And it's not particularly surprising to me that this book died fairly early. So while Werewolf by Night and Tomb of Dracula just kept running, Frankenstein's Monster wasn't so successful. Although I do like those initial stories quite a bit. The first half of this, almost, is pretty decent. A lot of that, again, is due to Mike Ploog. Mike Ploog, who also had a hand in Man-Thing, yes, my giant-sized Man-Thing rears its ugly head again. So the Man-Thing, which is Marvel's version of Swamp Thing, came out around this time. It initially came out in the same black and white magazine Savage Tales that Conan did. And I've got the omnibus here, which has the initial Man-Thing story in it, which is pretty cool. Man-Thing shifted over to Khazar. Did he show up in Khazar next of all things? Shows up in Khazar. Stupid Khazar. So lame. I hate Khazar. But the Man-Thing showed up in there. And eventually Man-Thing got its own really strange book. So this character is basically just this mindless monster who can like burn you with his burny hands. And he's basically a mindless thing. So all of the action in here, all the drama has to do with the other characters that this guy kind of shambles into and meets. Again, Mike Ploog spent some time on this book. And the Mike Ploog issues are probably, artistically at least, the best issues of Man-Thing. But Man-Thing is better known for Steve Gerber's stories. Steve Gerber's kind of strange, quirky, odd stories. And they were really weird. I'm not sure I would class Man-Thing exactly as being horror. It is, but it's sort of a weird fantasy type of book. It's hard to describe Man-Thing. It's just so strange. It's definitely worth reading. It's weird, but it is definitely unique. So Man-Thing is kind of like this weird part of the Marvel horror line. Marvel had a lot of other horror characters, though. None of them as successful as the Werewolf and Dracula. Most of those can be found in these omnibus volumes. I've got Marvel Horror Omnibus here, which is giant, which has the Living Zombie in it. The Living Zombie had its own book for a while. I'll show you a cover of the Living Zombie. This is Tales of the Zombie, about this guy who becomes a zombie. Black and white series of stories. They're an awful lot of fun. Like I said, they're not scary. They're kind of strange. All of these stories are really weird. They're all very much of their time. Very kind of cheesy horror kind of black and white stuff. Tales of the Zombie. I like Tales of the Zombie quite a bit. A lot of fun. Yeah, there we go. There's our zombie having adventures. But this volume, for example, also has the Living Mummy. There was a Mummy comic book for a while. We have Brother Voodoo in here. Brother Voodoo. The Living Colossus, the Golem, Gabriel, the Devil Hunter. We have Gabriel, the Devil Hunters in here. So there's Brother Voodoo there, who's kind of a voodoo superhero. I liked Brother Voodoo. And we have our Living Mummy here. Let's see if I can get a good example of the Living Mummy. These guys all attacking the Living Mummy over there. Not fantastic, the Living Mummy, but kind of cool. Kind of cool. It's Roger's favorite anyway, the Living Mummy. And of course, there were so many horror comic books that they came out with a second omnibus, Marvel Horror Lives Again. This one has Blade, Zatanna, Lilith, Ulysses Bloodstone, the Manphibian, you know, that classic is in here. Hodiah Twist, the flesh-eating Wendigo. Everything that's even vaguely horror-ish is in here. All of their other horror comic book kind of things. There's Lilith. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Lilith is the spawn of Dracula. That's Dracula's daughter. You know that because of her fancy outfit, you know. And we've got some, this issue is, this omnibus is pretty cool because this one reprints some of the old Tomb of Draculas, which came out after the Tomb of Dracula ceased publication. And it has just some excellent, creepy old artwork from Gene Colan. Gene Colan delivers, man, every time. Yeah. Cool stuff. Now, the Marvel horror line, it lasted a little while, but then it burnt itself out. And by the 80s, it was pretty much done. No one cared anymore by the 80s. By the 80s, it was finished. But it was a lot of fun while it lasted. Mike Ploog only drew comic books in the 70s. And then Mike Ploog moved on. And in the 80s, he worked on films. He worked on The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing. He worked on some other films. He worked on Ghostbusters. And so that's where Mike Ploog went. Probably did a lot better working on those films that he did in the comics. But for a short time, he did a lot of really cool, interesting artwork for the comic books. And it really only would have worked at that time. It really only would have worked in the 70s, his comic book work. Because, like I said, he was just too quirky. He couldn't really work in superhero comics. But for horror, the type of kind of campy, cheesy horror that Marvel was doing, he was perfect. And while Ploog was on any of those books, they were really cool. And then when he would leave, and maybe they'd be okay if Gil Kane was doing an issue or John Buscema was doing an issue here or there. But they wouldn't stay on those books. They had, like, real books to do. So a lot of Marvel horror stuff just fell apart and stopped selling because the quality was just not being maintained. It's one of those things, you know, if you make books that aren't good, people tend to stop buying them after a while. But when they're good, people love them. Like I said, Werewolf by Night was a strong enough character that he lasted a while, but eventually, even Werewolf by Night's book was so bad, people wouldn't buy it. Like I said, once Iron Man shows up in your werewolf book, it's done. It's all over. So Tomb of Dracula was the last survivor. Deservedly so, because Tomb of Dracula was a really good comic. I probably rambled on long enough. What do you mean incoherent? Don't listen to him. Anyway, I've probably rambled on long enough. You should go watch Steve's video, and Steve will tell you how all this stuff was just crap and not worth watching or not worth reading. But you know, just don't listen to Steve when it comes to stuff like that. This stuff was a lot of fun. A lot of the Marvel horror comic books were a lot of fun. You know, at least till they went, you know, crappy in the end. Okay, guys, that's all I have to say this week. Catch me next week when I talk about something entirely different. Okay, guys, I'll catch you next time.